Greetings and welcome to the podcast channel of the Major Contemporary Strategic Issues Chair. The theme for 2024 is Confrontations and Strategic Recompositions. This episode is an extract from a lecture given by Rose Gottemoeller, Diplomat, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, lecturer at the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Center for Security and International Cooperation at Stanford University, USA. The conference is entitled, The Resurgence of Nuclear Intimidation and the Resulting Pressure on Nuclear Deterrence Strategies. Don't hesitate to subscribe to our podcast or YouTube channel to keep up to date with all our publications. We hope you enjoy listening.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Very sorry my French is not as strong as it should be. I joked earlier on that if I had to deliver a lecture in Russian, I could do so, but I'm afraid not in French. So I welcome this opportunity. I'm extraordinarily honored to have this opportunity. Thank you to Dr. Gauthier and to his staff, to Ms Seglek, particularly for helping me to organize this visit. But I want to say what an enormous honor it is to speak here at the Sorbonne in this beautiful historic hall and to see before me so many of the experts in France on these topics, as well as those who are studying these matters today. And so it is very important for me to hear also your opinions and your views on these matters. I want to stress, as I begin to talk about the operation of deterrence during the war in Ukraine, that these are my own personal views. Dr. Gauthier mentioned my many years of service to the US government as well as to the NATO alliance. I always joke, it sounds like I can't keep a job when these things are reeled off, but obviously I've been working in the field, both in and out of government, for many, many years. And at this point, I am decidedly out of government. I am working as a lecturer at Stanford University and also as a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. So I'm speaking in my private capacity, very much in my private capacity, because some of the points I have to raise, I think, are rather difficult at this moment in a time when things are moving very fast in Ukraine. And indeed, I think even today, the deterrence picture is changing. And so perhaps in our discussion period, we can talk about how stable are the conditions that I'm going to lay out to you today, and whether in fact we are now at a pivot point and we might see a change in the intra-war deterrence situation. But let us take that up during our discussion period. Now I'd like to start by getting into what has been the behavior of Vladimir Putin over many months. And he has been at it again, Vladimir Putin, rattling the nuclear saber after a hiatus of some months. He largely fell silent in 2023 after Ukraine's armed forces became more mired in stalemate. He had no need to rattle the nuclear saber when his guys were winning. The current burst of nuclear talk seems linked to two objectives. First is Putin's need to worry the Republicans in the US Congress who are holding up US support to Ukraine. The more he makes them nervous, the better. Second is Putin's answer to those who say that Russia came close to using nuclear weapons in October of 2022, when it was the Russian armed forces who, with their backs to the Dnipro River, were poised for defeat. Not so, he says. I had no intention of using nuclear weapons. This is not what US intelligence sources told the US government. All of Putin's nuclear chatter since this war began is calculated to shape decisions in the United States and in NATO capitals. It is a form of influence making called intra-war deterrence. When I was an infant at the RAND Corporation in the nursery for nuclear priests, Intra-war deterrence was an orderly move up and down the escalation ladder, governed by skillful diplomacy and by rational actors. That was the vision that emerged from the nuclear strategists of the 1950s and the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear strategists such as Thomas Schelling, who actually has written on this very, I would say, too much orderliness to the nuclear escalation ladder, to his credit. But Putin has done his best to disturb that vision of orderliness. However, I would say so have other actors, and specifically the Ukrainians. And so I'm going to talk about how I see that today. Intra-war deterrence, as it is shaping up in this war in Ukraine, is not at all orderly and often seems irrational. But I would argue it is working. In this lecture, I will describe how intra-war deterrence is working in Ukraine and broach some ideas for how I think NATO can continue to strengthen it. Someday, we will want to analyze how deterrence worked in this war from the very beginning to the very end. But now is not the moment for that analysis. Instead, we must focus on how to sustain intra-war deterrence and try to ensure against its failure. At the beginning, the picture was not pretty. Overall deterrence of Russia clearly failed for Ukraine. In the run-up to Russia's invasion in February of 2022, America and its NATO allies took steps to warn Russia of dire consequences, including deep economic sanctions and political excommunication. But none of that mattered to Vladimir Putin. He was intent on the invasion. In fact, the second invasion of Ukraine, the first having been in February of 2014, when he seized Crimea and destabilized the eastern regions of Ukraine, the Donbass. Some argue that NATO failed to deter Mr. Putin because he has nuclear weapons. The Kremlin's nuclear saber-rattling feeds that view, bringing nuclear weapons to public consciousness in a way that they have not been for years. To be honest with you, I've welcomed it in the United States to have more public attention on nuclear weapons, including among my own students and young people, because for many years they had been on the back burner, not really something that the public or young people were thinking about. But not good that it came on the back of this invasion of Ukraine. Yet, as the war goes on, I would argue that Russia has indeed been deterred. Although the Russians rage against the arms and equipment that NATO countries are sending to Ukraine, they have not once attacked NATO territory to try to stop the shipments. The Russians brag, often without confirmation, about destroying NATO weapons once they arrive in Ukraine and are in storage or on the battlefield, but they have not disrupted transit in NATO territory. So Russia and NATO countries are equally deterred at this moment from direct confrontation, hewing close to the principle that President Joe Biden laid down at the outset of the invasion: the necessity to avoid a general war in Europe that could escalate to global nuclear annihilation. For America and NATO, this means assisting Ukraine, but not fighting for it. For Russia, it means not striking NATO territory. As the war continues, deterrence is taking on a more nuanced and complex character, a kind of multi-layered character that requires close attention. Take the efforts to continue grain shipments out of the Black Sea, despite the Russians' withdrawal from the UN-brokered grain deal last summer. When Russia left the deal in July, it declared a blockade of Ukrainian Black Sea ports, threatened commercial vessels with attack, and began bombing Ukrainian ports, destroying grain silos and infrastructure. Ukraine responded by appealing to NATO allies to support its efforts to ship grain and turning to its ports on the Danube. Although these river ports do not have the capacity of the large Black Sea ports such as Odessa, they do have certain advantages. One is their proximity to the Bosporus, which shortens the time it takes for ships to exit the Black Sea. Another is that a NATO country, Romania, is right across the river. NATO has been alert to Russian missiles straying over alliance territory, as happened again this morning when a missile strayed over Polish territory for about 30 seconds. NATO, in its response, has been warning Moscow sharply and keeping its defenses on high alert. Likewise, it has been policing Black Sea airspace adjacent to NATO countries that border the sea, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, using a combination of manned aircraft and drones. These NATO actions are having a deterrence effect that is benefiting Ukraine. The Russians on several occasions have attacked the Ukrainian Danube port at Izmail, but not with the massive firepower that has so damaged Odessa, and we saw yet another big attack on Odessa even today. Likewise, for the commercial vessels operating out of Ukraine's Danube ports, the presence of NATO aircraft over their shipping lanes provides some measure of security from Russian attacks. I call this proximity deterrence. The closer a Ukrainian facility is to NATO territory, the more it will avoid massive Russian missile strikes. The more sea transport lanes are close to NATO shores, close to NATO littoral, the more likely vessels operating there will escape Russian attacks. How long can this more nuanced notion of deterrence survive? After all, it does have limits. NATO is not providing naval escorts for shipping, and Russia and Ukraine are engaged in a strike-counterstrike dynamic in the Black Sea that changes day by day. Odessa was struck on March 15th. I mentioned the attack today, but Russia struck hard at Odessa on March 15th, killing 21 people. Ukraine has responded by going after Russian ports and ships. It attacked and destroyed the advanced patrol ship Sergei Kotov near Crimea on March 5th, and today it attacked, evidently, 2 additional landing ships that were deployed in Crimean ports. It has also targeted Russian commercial shipping in August 2023, attacking an oil tanker near the Kerch Strait Bridge, which Ukraine also damaged in July of 2023. These attacks delivered a clear message to Vladimir Putin. We are now able and willing, we the Ukrainians, to strike back in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians are skilled missileers, and they are making the most of their indigenous and rapidly evolving missile capabilities. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have continued to skillfully develop the wider intra-war deterrence game, again, I would argue, with remarkable success. Their relentless attacks on Russian naval forces have driven the Russian naval fleet to eastern regions of the Black Sea, out of range of the Ukrainian missiles. Ukraine has denied the Russian Navy their headquarters at Sevastopol. Today, Crimea is at best contested territory, limited in its utility as either a naval base or as a logistics hub for the Russian army in the eastern portion of Ukraine. To a significant degree, the Ukrainians have deterred the Russians from operating in Crimea. I say to a significant degree because the Russians are still launching missiles from Crimea, and the major attacks on Kiev that occurred today were involved missiles that were launched out of Crimea. But still, significant is significant, and I continue to argue that Ukraine has denied the Russians the capability to operate with impunity in the Crimea. Ukraine has used this success to solidify the shipping corridor in the western regions of the Black Sea. As of March 11th, 1,000 ships, commercial ships, have safely transited the corridor, carrying 30 million tons of grain and other products. Interestingly, here intra-war deterrence has been bolstered by shipping and insurance interests. The companies carrying on maritime trade in the Black Sea have ensured that both Russia and Ukraine recognize the downsides of striking each other's commercial shipping. As soon as either side experiences damage or destruction of a commercial ship, both countries will suffer the consequences in higher insurance rates and also in wartime premiums for shipping. Thus, each has an equal interest, and each is deterred from striking the other's commercial ships. As an aside, this lesson is evidently lost on the Houthis in the Black Sea and the Gulf of Yemen, who do not share the commercial interests of the countries trying to ship through the Suez Canal. On another day, we should consider the deterrence measures that may influence non-state actors, such as the Houthis, but clearly insurance burden is not one of them. To return to our main topic, commercial interests were never issues that touched the concept of intra-war deterrence in the Cold War. Then it was all about state actors and what they could do to halt and reverse escalation. Military forces certainly played a role, including for signaling. Nuclear signaling was a special mania of that period. Diplomacy was important for conveying messages and ensuring that they were received. But the role of companies, commercial companies, it existed only insofar as media companies participated in communicating between the sides. The prominently placed interview of a top leader in a national newspaper could have enormous value as a communication device, especially in the Soviet era when there were actually very few lines of communication open between Moscow and Washington. And we saw the role of correspondence during the Cuban Missile Crisis in delivering messages back and forth between the Soviet leadership at the time and the US leadership. Nowadays, this role of media companies is supercharged with the advent of social platforms. These speed up communications of messages among influential actors, such as the Russian military bloggers who have critiqued the Russian army's performance and ensured that stories of its failures are widely known. Their role as hardline influencers have also boxed in Vladimir Putin to a significant degree, giving him less flexibility for maneuver than he might otherwise have had. But their messaging is also contributing to intra-war deterrence, conveying to Kiev, too, the limits of Ukraine's maneuver room. While we note the existence of this deterrent effect, we need to consider carefully the risks of deterrence failure, as well as the situations where deterrence is not operating at all. At the present time, as I noted at the outset, we have a missile duel going on between Russia and Ukraine. Neither Russia nor Ukraine is deterred from launching long-range and medium-range missiles at each other. The Russians have made it a particular specialty to attack residential areas, including medical facilities and schools. Their use of the double tap, striking at a civilian target, then following up with another strike as emergency responders rush in, is a particularly despicable tactic which they honed to perfection during the civil war in Syria. This type of attack took place in the strike on Odessa on March 15th that killed 21 people. That included 3 emergency first responders. Both Russia and Ukraine have been attacking each other's industrial infrastructure, with Russia going after the energy grid, obviously, and again today, port facilities, and grain storage in Odessa and in other ports. Russia has also made it a special priority to go after Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, including in a massive missile attack on March 21st and again today. Although Ukraine has sent drones into Moscow, including evidently exploding one last May 3rd over the Kremlin, it has not made attacking the Russian capital a priority. Rather, in the run-up to Russia's presidential election last weekend, Ukraine has been using drones to attack oil refineries, up to 12 of them, and other energy facilities. Bloomberg reported that the 2 largest strikes account for up to 12% of Russia's oil processing capacity. It's worth emphasizing a couple of points about these Ukrainian strikes. First, only indigenously produced drones are being used, indigenously produced drones and missiles, not NATO-supplied missiles. Second, Ukraine does appear to be targeting industrial infrastructure, specifically gas and oil facilities, rather than civilian targets. This, in my estimation, sets them apart from the Russians. Third, the attacks are launched by the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Services, and not by the regular armed forces. In other words, the Ukrainians have been treating them as irregular operations. This allowed Kyiv to sustain a neither confirm nor deny posture toward the attacks on Russian territory when they first got underway early in the war. As President Zelensky, however, said in his address to the nation on March 16th, these weeks have demonstrated to many that the Russian war machine has vulnerabilities that we can reach with our weapons. What our own drones are capable of is a true Ukrainian long-range capability. Ukraine will now always have a strike force in the sky. So the Ukrainians are being increasingly open about these missile attacks, and this may be one factor in a changing intra-war deterrence relationship. And I think it's worth discussing and debating tonight what we think about this moment when the Ukrainians have moved from a neither confirm nor deny status of these attacks, increasingly now to embracing them. And as President Zelensky said on the 16th of March, to say we will now permanently have this capability for long-range attacks on Russian targets available to us. So it's an important moment and one I think to be considered very carefully. Thus, both Russia and Ukraine continue to threaten each other with missile attacks at medium and long ranges. The Russians attack civilian targets, the Ukrainians stay focused on war-supporting industry, but neither, at the moment, is deterred from continuing this missile duel. As this dynamic of missile exchanges continues to evolve, I think it could possibly spiral. And so it's necessary to think about what NATO's role must be on bolstering deterrence of Russia at this moment. My personal view is that NATO's rules of engagement must be reiterated clearly and forcefully. We are undertaking vigorous military assistance to Ukraine, but no NATO boots on the ground. At the same time, constant public reminders must be made of the NATO commitment to defend every inch of Allied territory, cautioning Russia not to risk penetrating NATO borders. Furthermore, the alliance must take pains to bolster proximity deterrence, for example, by keeping up air policing of Black Sea transit lanes close to NATO littoral states in the Black Sea, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey. And finally, this is a controversial point as well, which my own government may not agree with. NATO should let stand and indeed reinforce the message that it tolerates Ukrainian attacks on Russian targets so long as NATO-supplied weapons and equipment are not used. I think that this too can contribute to deterrence of Russia at this moment. But again, a point to be debated. And again, my own government may not agree with this notion of reinforcing that message. NATO and some should at any moment be prepared to strengthen deterrence of Russia. The current dynamic has a certain stability to it, but it could deteriorate at any moment, and it could be deteriorating even as we sit here tonight. Not only the Ukrainians, but also NATO countries must remain alert to that reality. The fast-moving nature of this strike-counter-strike dynamic makes it not possible to predict the future. At this time, Ukraine is enjoying the benefits of proximity deterrence in the Black Sea with its inherent limits, and it is continuing its shipping activities in and out of the Black Sea. However, if Russia decides to up its pressure in that neighborhood, NATO will face increasing danger of attacks straying onto its territory. This may be the moment at which deterrence fails and leads to direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. In that case, Washington and its allies must do everything they can to bring the temperature down. Escalation, particularly nuclear escalation, must at all costs be avoided. It is clear that escalation and de-escalation in this war are far from an orderly ladder, straight up, straight down. Intra-war deterrence takes place instead in a multifaceted dynamic environment with many actors. It's the swirl of action involving forces at combat, the leaders in Kiev and Moscow, and the countries of NATO interacting with Russia and supporting Ukraine. To sum up, we have several different layers of actors. Continued stability between the United States and Russia is all important to avoid the catastrophe of escalation to an all-out war that could lead to nuclear escalation. It involves sustaining, in whatever way possible, the basic rules of engagement that Biden laid down to begin with. The U.S. and its allies will do everything they can to assist Ukraine, but NATO military forces will not operate on Ukrainian territory. Russia will refrain from striking, indeed touching, NATO territory. Second, Kiev and Moscow continue missile strikes against each other's territory. Defending against them in a robust way is possible now, and we've seen that in the way both sides continue to claim, I think with some success on both sides, that they are defending against each other's missiles. Ukraine increasingly is taking public credit for these attacks, which it has focused on war-supporting industry. Russia has no compunction against hitting civilian targets, evidently, which adds to the litany of allegations against it concerning war crimes. For the sides to come to a ceasefire, a first step would be for both sides to be willing to pause these long-range attacks, these long-range missile exchanges. I just note that, to my mind, this could be a first step in movement toward a ceasefire, but we are long distance from that today. We are far away from that today. NATO countries in Europe, many of whom are also EU members, are supporting Ukraine not only with military assistance, but also ensuring that the Ukrainian economy continues to function. I fear that the Russians are working to disrupt this support, for example, through misinformation and disinformation campaigns that whip up public support for politicians opposed to military assistance to Ukraine. Certainly, I fear that could be an effect in my own country. NATO and EU cohesion, clear and unequivocal, is the best way to defend against such disruption. Sometimes NATO countries can also support Ukrainian activities more directly, such as the defense of Black Sea lines of communication in proximity to NATO territory. These have enabled the Ukrainians to exercise control of the Black Sea and open up a humanitarian transit corridor to ship grain and other products. And in the case of the eastern Black Sea, Ukraine has used its skill with its indigenous missiles and drone technology to deter Russia from operating its navy. The Russian Navy has withdrawn from Crimean ports and is operating out of Novorossiysk. The Russians also notably are evidently building a new naval port on the coast of Abkhazia, even farther east. That, of course, is Georgian territory, but that's another question altogether. The forces that deter in this war are, in sum, a mysterious mind game. Although not infallible, they have worked so far, especially preventing escalation to a nuclear exchange, and we need to keep it that way. In this lecture, I've been talking about kinetic forces and the more or less traditional use of weapons of war. It bears emphasizing, as I wrap up my remarks, that there's an entire realm of cyber attacks and other hybrid activities that I have barely touched on, such as information warfare. As we advance in our analysis of how deterrence is operating in this war, we will have to grapple with this gray zone. And from my time at NATO, I know that we consider the gray zone to already be a theater of conflict where day in, day out, there are cyber attacks occurring on NATO systems and also information warfare occurring with great regularity. So as we advance in our analysis of how deterrence is operating in this war, we will also have to grapple with this gray zone or this whole concept of hybrid warfare. I would like to invite your comments on how you are thinking about these problems in the hybrid realm as in the realm of conventional and kinetic warfighting. With that, I'd like to draw these remarks to a close. I look forward to your comments and your questions during our discussion period. Thank you very much.